Dr. Li Mengyan, a Chinese virologist who defected to the United States, had her account suspended by Twitter after publishing a research paper that suggested the CCP virus had a lab origin. We'll be explaining the significance of this. Also, the Chinese Communist Party is launching ideological attacks on U.S. officials, with Mike Pompeo being made out as the top enemy. I'll be explaining this. And also, it appears the two main political factions in China are now fighting for financial control. I'll be going in depth into what's going on right now behind the scenes in China. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. Dr. Li Mengyan, a Chinese virologist who defected to the United States, had her account suspended by Twitter after publishing a research paper that suggested the CCP virus had a lab origin. Now, there have, of course, been many claims on the virus origin, including man-made, lab-altered, lab-leaked, but natural, a purely natural origin, and others. The Chinese Communist Party's initial claim that the virus originated from an open wet market has been largely debunked, and many countries are still calling for investigations into the virus origins, and the CCP is still rejecting claims and rejecting ability of other countries to go in and investigate, although the WHO is there. Now, Dr. Yan and others are now criticizing Twitter for restricting scientific research based on political interests. You might all remember the investigative documentary that I helped make as well, investigating the origin of the Wuhan coronavirus, which went viral, and also looked into the different possibilities of the virus origin. Now, that documentary was not meant to come to hard conclusions. It merely looked into the evidence around different claims, but it was heavily censored after its release despite that. And while Dr. Yang's research is being censored, people are pointing to the types of claims and research from China that is being allowed by these same platforms. One Chinese researcher, for example, is claiming the CCP virus came from a meteor from outer space, and the research paper on it has been circulating online and over Twitter without facing any types of similar restrictions. One of the authors on these space origin papers from the Department of Infectious Disease Control at the Tianjin Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Tianjin, China. It also claims the Spanish flu came from space. Now, so what are we seeing here? Scientific research on a pandemic, something that's affecting just about every person on Earth, is being restricted. You are not allowed to research different tracks of a possible origin. The idea, for example, that the virus may have come from a laboratory in China, if you state that, you risk being censored by these different news outlets, by these different platforms, not based on science, but based on politics. This appears to be selective censorship. It ties to other accusations as well, again, of politically motivated censorship on these major platforms. And again, the type of research that scientists can do, the type of papers they can or cannot report on, is being decided by these platforms. Meanwhile, the CCP is launching ideological attacks on U.S. officials. Chinese state media are making Secretary of State Mike Pompeo out to be the top enemy of the CCP. The regime's mouthpiece TV station, CCTV, has called Pompeo the, quote, human public enemy, a, quote, political virus, and has accused him of insanity and has used other crude language to describe him.
散播政治病毒的蓬佩奥正把自己变成人类公敌。
There have been similar trends in other CCP news outlets, including Beijing Daily, which called him a, quote, fat pig. This ties into a broader trend we're seeing right now with the CCP in terms of diplomacy. Now, U.S. Ambassador to China Terry Branstad stepped down from his position in order to help with the re-election campaign of President Donald Trump. And this comes just a few weeks after the CCP shifted its tone on him as well. In the past, the CCP described Branstad as a, quote, old friend of the Chinese people. They praised him, for example, for helping make positive ties with Xi Jinping. Recently, however, the CCP's state-run People's Daily News outlet refused to publish one of his op-eds. Pompeo criticized the CCP for censorship and for having unequal standards on media access in the United States. He noted, for example, that China's ambassador to the United States, Kwai Tianjai, has published 5 op-eds in mainstream U.S. news outlets just this year. He has been interviewed as well in large networks. Now, the U.S. ambassador to China is not given anywhere near that access. The U.S. Embassy in Beijing posted a criticism of the CCP for this on its official Weibo page in China. This is one of the main CCP social media websites. It accused the regime of hypocrisy. And after that happened, a Chinese network administrator deleted the U.S. Embassy's statement. And similarly, Pompeo's chief China policy advisor, Yu Mao-chun, has faced heavy pressure from the CCP as well. He was removed from the honor roll by his alma mater at a middle school in Chongqing in China, and he's now being disowned by his family in Anhui, China. Now, the CCP often pressures family members of Chinese overseas if they speak out against the CCP. And now we see the CCP not even being shy about this, not even trying to hide it. They're doing this in a very public way against an individual tied to the Secretary of State of the United States. They're not trying to hide it. So what are we seeing again? The CCP is using personal attacks in its diplomacy. Now, previously they had again this wolf warrior diplomacy policy, where they had this no-holds-barred, different form of diplomacy, where they did not care about directly criticizing any statement that went against the interests of the CCP. Now, even in China, that program was accused of backfiring. It was saying it was having the opposite effect. And even Xi Jinping himself, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, was being criticized within his own circles for that project. Now, the CCP had announced that it was going to move away from that policy to take a more soft line when it comes to international diplomacy. But we see them now moving back on it. They're backtracking. And this is likely having the opposite effect again. This is showing the true face of the Chinese Communist Party to top U.S. officials. When they go and call them names, when they go and attack their family members, this shows exactly how the Chinese Communist Party operates. Because now these officials are seeing firsthand the kind of pressure that different Chinese dissidents have been facing for years. They're seeing now that this is not an exaggeration, that this is how, again, the Chinese Communist Party operates. Meanwhile, it appears the two main political factions in China are now fighting for financial power. These would be the CCP faction under Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, and another faction led by former CCP leader Jiang Zemin. He was 2 leaders ago. As NTD reports, Pan Gongshen, the deputy governor of the Central Bank of China, publicly stated that the work of taking over the trillions in assets from Tomorrow faction is progressing steadily. Now, Tomorrow faction, also known as Tomorrow Holding, is alleged to be the main money bag of Zheng Qihong, the number 2 figure in the Jiang faction. 2 months ago, Tomorrow faction publicly fought back against the takeover by party authorities. They made public statements on it. The CCP's State Counsel Office more recently held a regular policy meeting on September 14th where Pan Gongshen said that, quote, "The government has not included financial holding companies under supervision, which has led to chaos in the industry, such as interfering with the operations of financial institutions, benefiting through shadowy trader transactions, and arbitrating funds from financial institutions." Again, suggesting wrongdoings by the Jiang faction when it comes to this. Pan criticized specifically Tomorrow faction, Huaxin, and Anbang. In terms of where things are at, the CCP's supervisory authorities have already purged the equity of Baosheng Bank, Harbin Bank, Taiyuan Bank, and Weifang Bank under Tomorrow faction. The 3 trillion Tomorrow empire built by Xiao Jianhua, the founder of Tomorrow Department for more than 20 years, has officially ended. Xiao Jianhua was allegedly the white gloves of the Zheng Qinghong family, suspected of trading in the 2015 China stock market crash and initiated a financial coup against Xi Jinping. So again, the financial actions around this company, around these individuals, was interpreted by Xi Jinping as an attempted coup, using again the holding of the Jiang faction on the financial institutions as a weapon within these factional battles. That's how it was interpreted. On January 27, 2017, Xiao Jianhua was being taken away from the Four Seasons Hotel in Hong Kong by Chinese national security personnel and was taken back to the mainland for investigation. Now, it's worth noting, Huaxin, which was already taken over by the authorities, has also been accused of being involved in a conflict of interest between Xi Jinping and Zheng. Huaxin took off from Jiang Zemin's power center in Shanghai. They had again the Shanghai Gang, and its main business is in petroleum, again something closely tied to the Jiang faction. And this is also important since petroleum and the oil industry in China has always been controlled by Zheng Qinghong and CCP former security czar Zhu Yongkang. also a major player in the Jiang faction, who was purged by Xi Jinping. These two individuals used to be called the leaders of the, quote, oil gang. So what are we seeing here? There are factional battles behind a lot of what we're seeing on the surface. We see different companies getting hit. We see actions of the CCP targeting different industries. A lot of this is more than just what we see on the surface. A lot of this ties to factional battles. And what does this mean as well? It means that foreign investment into these companies, foreign investment into these sectors, if you're not considering the factional battles and political interests around them, it is a black swan, ongoing, because the CCP can end a company. The CCP can take actions against a company if that company is tied to a political figure who is currently being targeted. And again, when it comes to these factional battles, the main battleground right now appears to be security systems in China and the financial institutions in China. And we see a lot of action around these two areas. Also, the Epoch Times obtained leaked documents that show that student protests in Inner Mongolia against the CCP's influence are still ongoing. This is related to protests by students, parents, and others over the CCP's programs that require schools to teach classes in Mandarin rather than in the native Mongolian language. The CCP has been carrying out abuses in Inner Mongolia, similar to what it does in Tibet and Xinjiang, but Inner Mongolia is often overlooked. The document from September 9th that was received by the Epoch Times shows the school attendance rate of students in that area was only 23%. The local police station severely cracked down on improper remarks, they deemed at least, made by farmers and herdsmen or key tasks in the education field. Local authorities of the Chinese Communist Party also formulated various control measures. One of them, for example, was focusing on public policy, organizing household publicity teams with village cadres and teachers of the Chinese Communist Party, and sending agents of the CCP door to door to visit people's homes. The CCP has also been launching programs to monitor public opinion, including monitoring chat groups on Chinese social media app WeChat, again around these protests. So what are we seeing here? The Chinese Communist Party has made a large-scale response over what are really just student protests and protests by parents. This would not have been a big deal in most countries in the world. This would have been seen as a local issue with a small school district. For the CCP, however, this is regarded as a national security threat. A few parents going out to protest, a few students going out to protest against a language program. Again, not a big deal for most countries. For the Chinese Communist Party, viewed as a direct threat to its hold on power. And very likely this says something about what the CCP is afraid of. It's very likely afraid that this could escalate into a Hong Kong-like situation, yet in the mainland. And they're afraid, one of the big concerns with Hong Kong, was that protests like this, unrest and uprisings against the hold of power by the CCP, could spread throughout all of China. And now this taking place in the mainland would be interpreted more directly as a threat to the CCP's hold on power. Now, shifting to some news in the United States, the Trump administration is now investigating the investigators when it comes to the team of former Special Counsel Robert Mueller and others who ran the Trump-Russia investigations. It's now been revealed that when the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General went to review the devices of the investigative team, Mueller's team had erased the data on at least several dozen phones for various reasons. To learn more about this and its significance, we've invited to speak with us today Marc Ruskin. Now, Marc is a 27-year veteran of the FBI, a regular contributor to the Epoch Times, and author of The Pretender: My Life Undercover for the FBI. He also served on the legislative staff of U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, served as an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, New York, and is an adjunct professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Let's jump into that now. Hey, Marc, it's great having you back on Crossroads.
Great to be back, Josh. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, no, it's great having you back. So, first off, we've heard this news story now that the Mueller Special Counsel, they were asked to hand over their cell phones to DOJ, Department of Justice investigators, and they erased several dozen phones. Now, there's different excuses for this. Some say they had to erase them, some said they couldn't access the devices, and they erased themselves. Some said that they just had to do it. Now, in terms of your own work, doing investigations like this for the FBI, work with the Department of Justice. Is this common practice, and how would this normally be treated if investigators are checked for things like this and it turns out they deleted their phones?
Well, the obvious response would be that there's a suspicion on the part of these prosecutors, on members of the Mueller team, of having actually engaged in what's referred to as tampering with evidence. But tampering with evidence is a crime in and of itself, as distinguished from obstruction of justice. Now, when the Mueller report came out, there was much talk about obstruction of justice and whether or not there had been obstruction of justice. But in this case, it really would fall under the umbrella of tampering with evidence, which involved, among other things, can be defined as the destruction of potential evidence of criminal activity. Now, since it was destroyed, we don't know what the content was and whether or not there was criminal activity on the part of these prosecutors, but it's certainly a strong possibility. And one would ordinarily have to start to think about would be what was the content of these texts, let's say, that would cause someone to actually wipe the memory clean on a number of cell phones. Obviously, if there were 20 plus cell phones, which all happen to have their memory wiped clean due to excessive entry of erroneous passwords on the part of professional prosecutors or of attorneys, it would seem like to go beyond to stretch credulity to think that there's any kind of coincidence involved. So there's a lot of issues that come up now. For example, not just the content, but you would also have the phone logs themselves, like who was being called, at what time were the calls made, and what's the sequence of calls. For example, let's say one's looking at Andrew Weitzman's phone, for example, looking at a log of incoming and outgoing calls, not even looking at the content now, but just looking at the log itself. What if there's an incoming call from Christopher Steele, and then 10 minutes later there's an outgoing call to Robert Mueller, and then 10 minutes later there's an outgoing from CC. That's now apparently been lost, but that's the kind of information which we would be perhaps what they were trying to obfuscate and hide.
Now,
I mentioned, for example,
go ahead, sir. Good question. Well, I think one big question a lot of people would have is, wouldn't call logs like that be held by the phone carriers as well? One, so couldn't they still get that from the phone carriers? And two, if all they did was reset these phones to their factory settings, I mean, the average guy on the street, we think that, the FBI can recover your data if they, really want your data. And we hear all this stuff about the, federal agencies like the NSA having logs of all of our stuff. Can't they use that type of data for things like this? Or is that, is this just sci-fi spy movie type stuff?
Well, I would think that if nowhere else, that on the Department of Justice enterprise servers, at time by law, logs of all of this kind of information. So perhaps it won't be easy to access technically and also legally. It may be necessary to follow legal procedures in order to have access. But I would be surprised if there aren't Department of Justice servers upon which this data would reside. Perhaps what they were, either they didn't think that far ahead, or they didn't think that it would go that far at the time that they wiped their cell phones clean. I'll mention the importance of this kind of data is such that in many FBI investigations, the FBI uses what we refer to as pen registers. A pen register is essentially a machine which is attached to technically to a phone line and does not record the content, because the content now is protected, and you need a judicial warrant to intercept content. But you don't need a judicial warrant to intercept what's registered in the pen register, which is the actual numbers being called and the numbers calling in and the time and date of these calls. And that is used a lot in white-collar investigations and in terrorist and criminal enterprise, or organized crime type of investigation. So the data is important data and could be revelatory in this particular situation.
And we'd think an investigation into the President of the United States, that would be held at least on that same level of importance, that they would use a device like this. I mean, given standard protocol, would that be the normal standard of protocol?
Right. Well, one would imagine, if in a reasonable world, that the highest possible standards would be applied in an investigation involving the highest level of political figures. But we have to look a little bit also at who are the characters that are involved. I mean, in particular, Andrew Weissman, if one looks at his history with regard to the investigations of Enron, or the prosecutions of Enron and Arthur Anderson, as well as Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska, you have the impression that we're dealing here with individuals who, though sworn to enforce the law, seem willing to play fast and loose with the law when it serves what they believe or perceive perhaps to be a justifiable end. And look at other examples in this particular case, what's referred to as Brady material. Brady material is evidence that's in the possession of the prosecution that is exculpatory. And Brady is a Supreme Court decision which obliges prosecutors to divulge this kind of information. And just looking at here in recent cases, look at the Michael Flynn prosecution, where you appear to have a good example of Brady material being withheld from a criminal defendant in a very high profile and high level investigation.
Now, that said, folks, again, we're broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. If you want to support us, again, please join us on Patreon. You can find the link to the Crossroads page on Patreon in the description below. If you haven't already, also, please don't forget to like and subscribe on this channel. It really helps us grow. And if you want to go the extra miles I always mention, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads and consider sharing this video. Now, that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.